Julian Meyrick, who do critics write for, or perhaps who should critics write for?
Well, perhaps a way of approaching that question is asking, who can the form address? What's it capable of? And I noted the other day, because I was reading a book on it, that Joseph Stalin was a critic, and quite a good one too, actually, and that he chose to announce his changes in aesthetic line by writing anonymous reviews, which he would then post in Prada. And that had me thinking about what is it about reviews particularly that are so useful to tyrants? Not just tyrants. And as a way of unpacking that question, and it occurred to me that one of their uses is that they are a short form of discourse. They're relatively compact, and you need to provide within that form relatively little evidence in comparison with other forms of inquiry for the opinions that you hold. And therefore it's very easy to merge from a kind of subjective response to a depth insight and kind of blur the line between the two. And by the time anybody's really got wind of what you're doing, the moment has passed. So in that sense, the question of, well, who do critics write for now is a kind of social one. It changes. But underneath that question, I think is a very real issue of what the short form of critical reviewing is actually capable of.
So comparing critics, or noting that Stalin was a critic, you don't hold critics in very high regard.
No, I do. On the contrary, I think it's an extremely important form of discourse. That sounds very bland. But what I'm really pointing out is that the form itself has ideas, regardless of the ideas we have about it. And we can sit up here and we can pontificate, or we can denounce. But the truth is that it is a discipline, and it has certain things that it can do and certain things that it can't.
Alison Croggon, as a critic, who do you write for?
Well, the truthful answer is that I actually don't know. And but it's kind of interesting because I have, as a print critic and as a blogger, I have two distinct modes of critical address, and they're both short forms, or what you would certainly call short form criticism, Julian. And certainly in the print mode in daily newspapers, I have very real restrictions. The average review is 400 words. So there I'm writing for whoever is reading the newspaper. I don't know how you quantify that, who those people are. And so in a real sense, I'm writing for my editor there. With the blog, I write much longer reviews. I can write whatever I like. I'm autonomous. And the reason I like doing the blog is that no one can sack me or tell me what to do.
I mean, you're doing it for yourself. You're
yes,
not being paid to do
I'm
it,
obviously not paid, and it's a voluntary kind of compulsion, if you like. I love going to the theatre, and I love talking about what I've seen and discussing it, and I see that very much as part of an ongoing conversation that I think is the wider thing of culture.
Conversation with who? With
whoever is interested.
Anyone who's interested in theatre, who goes to the theatre.
Yes.
Cameron Woodhead, do you write for the same audience as Alison, do you think?
Well, Alison just said that she didn't know who she writes for. So I think, with newspaper criticism, yes, you're writing for a particular audience, the people who buy the newspaper. The review may or may not appear online. So yes, I agree with Alison. You're writing for whoever is interested, and I don't think that is limited to people who actually go to the theatre in any instance. I think that you're writing to a more general audience, and part of the job of criticism, in my view, is to make art accessible to a broad audience. That's that kind of criticism. There are a lot of other kinds of criticism. Academic criticism aims at a kind of academic audience, and I think part of the problem with criticism is that there are a multiplicity of audiences, really, and they're competing. And it's sort of it's very difficult to kind of reconcile them. You're kind of being torn sort of one way and another all the time as a critic, and that's part of what makes it both sort of incredibly frustrating and very rewarding. I'd also agree with Alison that at base, yes, you're writing criticism for yourself. There's a sort of split self going on there. Part of writing criticism, part of the discipline of writing criticism is to find out what you really think, to reflect,
interrogate your own ideas,
to interrogate your own ideas, and to put them out there where they can form part of a discussion about theatre.
But do you also have in your head like the audience or the director or the actors? I mean, because you know they're going to read it, presumably.
Indeed, yes, you do. But well, yeah, of course they're part of your audience, and you know they're often. I think the other thing to put the whole thing in perspective is that. Criticism as a sort of form of writing is picked out, but critical thinking is so important to the entire enterprise, and critical thinking is something that I think underlies art generally, and that you can't really separate art from criticism. I know it was said the other night that that criticism is a secondary thing, that it's almost a parasitic thing, that it relies upon art as a primary thing in order to exist. I don't think that's the case. I think that the kinds of distinctions, the decisions that are made during that artistic process necessarily involve value judgments and critical decisions. And I mean, I think particularly with the role of the director, say, is a director a critic? I think yes, a director is a critic. They just don't. They don't write. They translate from text to performance.
Stephen Sewell, what do you see as the role of the critic in criticism?
I feel a bit like a pig being asked, "What sort of butcher I want?" But I hope that's not the nastiest thing I say tonight. I'd rather than address that particular question, I've known many critics and many reviewers over the years, over the 25, 30 years that I've been working, and enjoyed most of their company most of the time. But for me, that's not the. I know that. There's an easy way to kind of turn this into a bloodfest. But before we do that, I'd like to say to quote Michael Billington, the famous British playwright, who said of Australian criticism that we are much too harsh on ourselves. And that he at least sees his position in the UK as being a partner with the creative people, with the theatre practitioners and the theatre participants in creating and cultivating an English theatrical culture. And I think that's an honourable, a very kind of noble way of conceiving what he does, and an interesting criticism from a foreigner of what we do here in Australia. Who are they for? You know, who are they writing for? I would like to see the critics and the reviewers as writing for me to help me and assist me in the terrible effort of producing theatrical art.
Well, this is the kind of noble sentiment I was talking about at the beginning. This is, I suppose, what I was holding up as an ideal, the idea that the critic is there to engage with the production and encourage greater quality, greater discernment, and so on. Alison Croggon, is that what you think you do?
I know I hold these lofty ideals, and the danger of holding lofty ideals is that you can fail them miserably. But and I think one of the things about criticism is that it never, ever feels good enough. That, Cameron was talking about it being a secondary art. And I actually think that's true, that it is. It's a responsive art, but it's still an art. So there's a discipline and a responsiveness. You need the art to respond to, which isn't to say it's inferior. It's as Stephen was saying, an honourable art. But Oh God, I've lost the track.
Well, let me come back to
Yeah.
the metaphor of pigs and butchers. Julian Meyrick, I mean, without the butcher, we don't get any pork. I mean, do we need, in fact, some sharp knives out there?
I've had several slices of bacon from me in the time. I was just thinking, as Stephen and Alison were talking about that, about my experience of, as a historian, I've read thousands of reviews, and as an Australian theatre historian, I've read a lot from, the post-war period. So, Harry Kippax, Catherine Brisbane, Kevin Kemp, Brian Hode, all these people who, once were warriors and now have kind of disappeared, really. And the fate of the critic, I have to tell you, in a personal sense, is not great.
I mean, they don't age well?
No, they don't.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying that in any kind of pejorative sense. I'm just saying that as a historian, they often find themselves quite isolated by the end of their lives, and that's not...
They're on the wrong side of history in the end.
It can be the case, and I'm a historian, and most people's lives don't end well, so, perhaps...
You die.
Yeah, that's right.
I just remembered what I was going to say, which was when I was a young critic, when I first started reviewing, which was in the early 90s, and I read a number of formative critics. One essay was David Mamet's address to critics, which you probably know, which I found really inspiring, where he was calling for critics to be part of the theatre culture, not above it. And I think this is something digital culture has done to criticism, which maybe we can talk about a bit later. And the other was critics like Robert Brustein, who I think have aged well, Julian, who are still, warriors, if you like, defending what they see as, the important.
But also more cautious. I mean,
Yeah.
Robert was out here just a few years ago talking about Himalaya criticism,
Yes.
that famous remark about, what do you think of the Himalayas, loved him, hated her, and kind of warning. And I sat with a bank of Melbourne critics at that time as he lectured them, I thought from personal experience, about not making off-the-lip remarks at length. At least that's what I heard.
Oh, okay.
Kind of perhaps drawing from his own lengthy experience of, both getting it wrong and getting it right.
Well, he has spoken at length again about the contemporary critical thing where the critical authority has apparently just fallen to pieces and now it's all democratic and this bothers him.
Oh, yeah.
And he does feel lost in that. So he's an old-fashioned critic, but he's still there.
Can I get back to the point that Alison made about criticism never feeling good enough? I think that's inevitable. There's a great story in one of Montaigne's essays about a case that was sort of so difficult and so finely poised, and both sides had such kind of equal merits that the ancient Greek judges sort of turned around to both parties and said, "Come back in 100 years for your verdict." And I think we don't have that luxury. One of the fundamental problems with criticism is that we aspire for it to be just. Justice is very important, I think, both to criticism and to art. And we have with newspaper criticism especially, we've got a very finite time to kind of cogitate, respond, reflect, and a very short number of words. Now, that's as it should be. Is it fairer to send the parties away and sort of, have them die before they get their verdict? No, that's not fair. That's not achievable. What we need, and I guess art, the great thing about art, unlike the parties, is that art does survive the 100 years, and I think in 100 years' time we'll be, we'll be having the same discussions, and people will be looking at us, and kind of picking through our failings as critics and artists, and looking to the discussion to sort of to see where the culture is going and where this discussion is going.
There is, I think, a difference in reviewing film. There is a difference, I think, in reviewing theatre compared to, say, literature, in that theatre is a very emotional experience. You're engaged in the performance, but criticism surely is a reflective thing. I mean, to get the critical distance and actually intellectualise, if you like, or analyse what it is you felt in the theatre, that surely takes a bit of time. But you presumably have to write immediately.
Very often. I think that, I suppose there's things I'd take issue with there, in that I don't think in any of my response to any kind of art differs enormously from that of theatre. You know, my response to poetry, say, is similar to my responses to theatre, that theatre just makes a whole lot of things really obvious because it occurs in time and in space, and it's in the same space that you are in. But essentially, I read a poem in time and then it's finished, and I will have, yes, these very direct emotional responses to it.
Absolutely. I mean, theatre is the most empathic of the arts. It has encoded into its very structure the idea that, and embodies the idea that we can be someone else. Yeah. It encourages empathy. That's why it's been around for thousands of years, and that's why it will continue to thrive, I think.
But it's still, I would say, an intellectual art, wouldn't you, Stephen? As well?
As well, yeah, absolutely, yes. Yeah. But what's the... Oh, you fascinate me. Absolutely. Especially like the work that I do is primarily emotional and deeply emotional. But what critical faculties, what critical categories do you bring to an emotional response? What does a critic do? I mean, I've been in situations where the audience had a very strong reaction, emotional reaction to what they've seen, including the reviewers, the people there, and then they've kind of distilled that experience into something kind of quite intellectual that's completely denied the emotionality of the night.
Well, I mean, yes, you have to do justice to both. The intellect isn't separate from the emotion, where it's all in the same vessel.
Yes, it should be, and obviously in the art of theatre, that's what it is. And you're quite right to point out that's why, or when it works, you know, that's why it works, and that's why the audience comes and has been coming for 2,500 years. But the paradigm for criticism, as I understand it, is primarily an emotion. A cool, judgmental, intellectual one.
Well, I don't buy that. I think that, well, certainly in my practice, which is refracted, as I said, through different kinds of things. But my most personal responses, if you like, quote unquote, are on the blog, and they always stem from feeling first. Which can be quite challenging because it's one of the great challenges of theatre is that as if you're primarily a writer as a critic, and yet theatre exists, its language is all sorts of things that are not writing as well. It's performance, it's design, it's all these sensual things that occur at once on the stage, and those amount to a feeling. And it's that I'm always responding from first. And the challenge is, how do you articulate that? How do you take that experience, wonder what it is, wonder why it happened? And I mean, that's a fascination, because so much of that is inarticulate. It's not in language. It's a challenge. And I think that's where that primary feeling that you have when you see something really brilliant that completely knocks you out, how can you write something that is equal to that experience? It always feels never good enough.
Let's talk about feelings a bit. And I'll come back to a kind of a point that I was going to make as a historian again. And Al and Cameron, you can say, oh no, we're in a brave new world and we're completely beyond that. But I noticed, tracking the reviews from, let's say, the early 60s, which is when Patrick White starts getting a real duffing up, for plays that he's now lionised for, and going through, you know, the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and watching the same thing happen with monotonous regularity, and stepping back from that and going, well, what's going on here? And a thought that I had, and this is where you can kind of say that we're beyond it, is that criticism, theatre criticism in the kind of Shaw mode, hits England at the same time that the repertory theatre movement is beginning and the notion of a critical drama is really just taking root. In Australia, it's the reverse. Drama is really about acceptable representations on stage. It's about getting an image up there, whether you're talking about acceptable nationalism or acceptable internationalism or acceptable multiculturalism, that everybody can agree on. And that kind of runs like a viral cold through all this criticism, to the point that it starts to evacuate its intellectual the solid ground intellectually beneath it. Obviously I can't prove it, we're in a forum, but I could show you many examples of it, and you would just go, there's something weird going on here. And historically, there's some evidence for that, because after the Second World War, the Australian government, which at that time was run by Curtin and Chifley, felt that Australia was predominantly an illiterate country. People didn't read enough, and they needed to have their sense of Australianism cemented by drama in particular. Drama could do that. And I feel you see the dead end of that in TV drama, actually, when you look at something like Packed to the Rafters, if you can bear to see it. You're looking at something that still kind of carries on that honourable tradition of saying nothing at length so we can all feel good about ourselves.
I think that's a really interesting point, Julian, and I think there's ways in which you're absolutely right. The idea of acceptable representation. But I was wondering how much you think that might have to do with colonialism and this terrible feeling that we're not quite acceptable.
Yes, I think it does. I think it comes from a non-self-acceptance. I mean, I say that now, but actually John McCullum said it in his recent book on Australian playwriting in the 20th century belonging, so he said it much better than I've said it. I just see it in the reviews. I should shut up. But
it raises an interesting question, and Stephen Sewell, you alluded to this earlier, the idea of there being some kind of collaboration between the critic and the industry, that they're both working together for the advancement of the whole. And I wonder if that means that there should be a kind of cultural bias, there should be a kind of critical nationalism. The critics should treat Australian plays, for example, differently than they might other work.
That is such crap. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. It's rubbish. And particularly in theatre, because most of what we see is Australian plays. So if we're going to kind of, give everyone a free pass, then we'll end up kind of liking everything. No.
But I don't think that's necessarily the implication of what Peter said. You can. I think for me, one of the greatest Australian reviewers was Catherine Brisbane, and Catherine Brisbane is certainly a very rigorous. She had those qualities that you want. She was rigorous, articulate, informed, and she loved Australian theatre. But she didn't give anyone a free pass. But she certainly didn't go out of her way to kick people when they were down. No, I mean, which I think that's what Michael Billington was referring to, that we're much more critical of ourselves. And I think what Julian just said, I don't think it's just an insecurity. I think we actually suffer from a self-hatred.
So you're going the idea of a cultural cringe, in fact.
Yeah.
That we're not good enough.
Not good enough, and never will be.
Yeah.
You do see that. There was a thing in The Guardian just today which depressed me enormously online, which was all about how it's an Australian, I don't know whether any of you caught up with it, but it's online, an Australian whose name I forget, who runs a venue in London, who's doing a very worthy thing of doing readings and productions of Australian plays, but he was sort of there saying, Australians, are not confident enough to support their theatre. And I was sort of going, that's not true. We have the most extraordinary theatre culture here. We really do. And I see people supporting it. It's a lively, very engaged community. Maybe I'm just speaking from Melbourne here, but there are people, shows that sell out without even a review. There's a community that goes to theatre. There is, really interesting theatre being done. It's diverse. It's innovative. And people are very articulate in saying so.
And so therefore it's robust enough for whatever critics want to say about it.
It's erratic. You know, that's what it looks like. But it looks like a skiddy car on ice. I'll give you another example. I was reading Louis Nara's second part of his memoirs, Shooting the Moon, and I came across the chapter that is devoted to the Golden Age. And that's a great play. I mean, that is a fantastic play. One of the first plays I saw when I came to Australia, and I was like, well, this is certainly, you know, a very impressive kind of culture if it can produce a play like that. And I was shocked, I think I can use that word in the non-maidenly sense, shocked to discover that it didn't garner a single good review, not one in the entire country, and that it kind of, well, it, you know, stopped that playwright from writing for a couple of years. And, I had a few shrewd guesses about what it might have done to him permanently. And, you know, then within a few years, of course, it had been produced internationally, and the views on that particular play had changed. Now, not only is that driven by kind of self-hatred, but if you're going to chainsaw through your artists like that, you're not going to have any. You know, you're just going to end up gutting them.
And yet what we're seeing at the moment is the reverse of that, I think. The Australian theatre scene has never been more vibrant and dynamic. And let's get back to criticism at the same time as the arts is proliferating and enjoying a sort of boom. Newspaper revenue has, been confronted with this challenge of the internet, and how do you kind of get advertising, and we're going through the process of adjusting to a new model.
That's been one of the themes running through these discussions, and that is the decline of the established kind of system of the mainstream established newspaper, if you like, and the rise of a much more democratic, much more diverse, but much less quality-controlled internet. And I wonder if you see that as a good thing or a bad thing, or
it's
good.
Both.
It's both.
It's absolutely both.
I mean, you, for example, Cameron, you said earlier on, you get 400 words in The Age to review a play, and that's as it should be. I wonder if that is as it should be. And
it is, if I may take the debater's case, as it should be, precisely because, to be fair to everyone, what's going to miss out if the reviews are longer? It's going to be the small independent theatre, the stuff that most needs to get reviewed. And as a matter of equity, that stuff needs a voice.
But Alison, if I look at your reviews in The Australian and then read the equivalent version online, the version online is far more nuanced, far more detailed, and, dare I say it, far more interesting.
I hope it is, yeah. And I noticed when I started reviewing for The Australian how, because I have to do it straight away, instead of having maybe I could take 5 days if I want to, because there's no one asking me for these reviews, how it can, if I'm not careful, lock my thoughts up. That I have to get everything in these phrases, get it down, get it into newspaper language, if you like, and that can close off a whole lot of possibilities of thinking before I even begin. I have to be careful when I'm thinking about it later. And I think that means that there's a whole vocabulary that doesn't get into the public discourse. And Lynn Gardner, the Guardian critic, has also talked about this kind of thing.
The internet is the ultimate public discourse, though, isn't it? I mean, one of the things that irritates me when people sling around terms like mainstream media is the internet has such a high saturation, it must surely be part of the mainstream media by now.
Of course it is, yeah.
Well, I mean, Alison, you began your blog Theatre Notes before you were a reviewer for The Australian.
Yes,
In fact, one led to the other. So that shows, I guess, the power of online writing.
Yes, I mean, it's there and it's accessible, and that's the brilliant thing about it. But it has changed quite dramatically the whole question of what journalism is. There was a thing I read today, I might just read it briefly too. It says, it's by this guy Jay Rosen from New York University, and he was talking about, and I think this applies to critics too, the change of the public, and he was saying this is very similar to what happened in the 18th centuries when the public became articulate. And he says the journalist, this idea of objectivity, which has always been a bugbear of mine because it's just a lie, actually, especially in criticism. The journalist is just a heightened case of an informed citizen, not a special class, and I think that's true. And treating people as a public which is what the internet offers, even if it always fails of its promise, because it constantly does, means refusing to float above them. And instead of claiming that you have no view, no stake, no perspective, no situated self, try to level with the users and let them know where you're coming from. Transparency is the new objectivity. And
sounds like a license for narcissism to me, Alison.
No, I don't think so, because the idea of objectivity, so-called, is really just a cover for, actually, usually conservative ideology.
Were you seriously thinking of Wittgenstein's Tractatus when you saw Lely Katz's Terrible Mysteries of the Volcano, or was that?
Oh yes, I didn't make it up.
Well, I think reading your reviews that sometimes you're more interested in sounding clever than telling the truth. But not that one can't do both.
Okay.
But obviously there's a tension.
There is obviously a tension. Julian Meyrick, what about, surely the critic must bring some base knowledge of understanding. There has to be some expertise there, doesn't there?
Yeah, there does. I think so.
And the internet can be, all just, well, it was awesome, or it was great, or, you know what I mean? Is there a danger in losing the kind of the big critic, I suppose? The established critic.
I'll just go back to the internet, because I think the 18th century comparison is a good one. And it was mainly to do with the cheapness of publishing, that made pamphleteering in particular much more affordable for all sorts of people who then had to learn to write. But it took about a century before the protocols for publishing were in place, and you had a genuine kind of culture of exchange of ideas. And my perception of the internet, like everybody of a certain age, I'm kind of a bit scared of it, is that it's still yet to accrue its most important conventions and therefore define itself in terms of its aspirations, rather than as a kind of nightmare version of what we all hope we don't end up doing.
Why are we talking about the internet as if it were a person? There are people.
Because it often has.
There are people involved in this equation. Alison is her own editor, and she moderates the comments on her blog. I note that she's much more scrupulous at kind of deleting stuff that defames her than she is at deleting stuff that defames anyone else.
That is not true, Cameron. By the way, thank you. Oh, sorry, I would really object to that, because that is not true.
Well, my experience of the internet is that it's basically it's so full of trolls. That's basically the reason that I haven't gone there. One of my first experiences as a very young critic was on a bulletin board being called Peter Craven's sex slave, and I've been called.
Oh, that's not fair.
Yeah. And once it's there, it's there.
He told me I was the only one.
Yeah. And of course, all kinds of defamatory stuff is published on the internet. That's the downside. The downside is that there really is no quality control, and if the price of opening up the kind of public debate to a sort of a democratic voice, which at its best is a wonderful thing, and I think criticism should be a discussion. If it comes at the price of, Cameron Woodhead hated my stuff, what a penis, and, all kinds of ridiculous Year 10 stuff, making fun of people's surnames, what have you, then is that a price that's too high to pay? I think you're right. I think we will eventually kind of, conventions will settle in, and I don't know if they will. I think we're going to end up with islands of stability on the internet, which the best metaphor for the internet that I came across is sort of in Borges' essay, The Total Library, which is an extension of the monkey at a typewriter thought experiment. If you sit a monkey at a typewriter long enough, eventually, just by chance, he'll write the complete works of Shakespeare. And I think that is basically what we're getting. And Borges says, of course you're going to get all kinds of masterpieces, and the internet will provide us with them. But, generations and generations of humans will live and die and experience nothing but gibberish.
Stephen Sewell, as a playwright, I mean, do you still look to the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age and the Australian for reviews of your work, or do you equally, and other work, or are you equally looking now online?
I have a terrible confession to make. I hardly ever read reviews unless they're helpfully shoved in my face by a friend.
But you just, at the beginning, you'd said all this stuff about critics being essential, essential to the cultivation of, quality theatre in Australia.
And you don't
even listen to the critics. So you don't read them.
That's right. I don't read them. I've sort of stopped reading them many years ago when I realised that they weren't actually saying anything.
So you think we need a new lot of critics, a different critics?
No. I think everyone's a critic. I agree with you about that. I'm a critic. I'm a terrible critic. I'm such a bad critic that I'd be murderous if I was given my yeah. So I admire your tact in engaging in the work, because it'd be work that I just couldn't do. Everyone's a critic, of course they are.
I know, but we have, the critics who write about... Well, I mean, Julian Meyrick, what about you? As a director, do you read your critics?
Actually, I don't read mine.
Well, you must. You chucked a big hissy fit. Let's
quite how I describe it, Cameron.
Sorry, we've just lost the sound for a second. I think we're back. I would say, Julian Meyrick, you have responded to your critics, including the two very critics right here on this panel, when they didn't like your production of The Birthday Party.
No, yes, that's right. And then spent the next...
And accused us of being partisan, I might add. You accused both of us of being partisan, and I'm pretty sure that Alison and I would both agree that we sit on the cross benches, although I'm sure she thinks I'm Bob Catter.
It wasn't quite like that.
No hat, Cameron. Where's the hat?
I came forward because I felt that there were some things in both your reviews that pointed to a wider cultural issue that I felt I had to address, and I took no pleasure in it for what it's worth. And on the whole, I don't think that artists should write back, although I notice, again, having ploughed through all those reviews, that Australian artists do all the time. And some of the cant that I heard from my own colleagues who just like, you shouldn't do that. And, I'd been looking at James Waits and Richard Werrett go at hammer and tongs in the pages of the Sydney Morning Herald. So, from time to time, things do need to get flushed out in the open.
Why do you think we're partisan, if I may ask?
Did I use that word?
Yes.
I'm not sure I did.
Partisanship is the essence of Alison's craft
and
mine too.
Well, actually, I was making a kind of point there, and if you are interested, I'll try and explain it. I felt that, and perhaps this is something that reviews kind of struggle with because of the short-form nature, was I felt that we are living in a world where preferences are increasingly replacing arguments as a way of kind of expressing what should be the case. A sort of an extension of the customer is always right. You don't need to really critically assess what it is that people's responses are. The fact that they have those responses means that they're right. I'm not saying that's particularly true of your criticism, but I'm just saying that I feel that's out there in the intellectual atmosphere.
And you went on to say that you could predict in advance what Alison was going to say in her
reviews.
Unfortunately,
that's true some of the time.
Some of the time. Can I just say briefly on that, because I don't want to get into this, because we've had this argument online, and you can Google it if you want. That I really welcomed your response and made my own response, because I do think I have never thought that what I write is the last word ever, and I long for intelligent conversation and challenge, and that's what makes it exciting and interesting and makes culture matter, I think.
Let me just push this, because I think it's important for both of you, actually, and you may perceive that my manner in that letter was kind of punitive, and it was a little bit. But that was not the only...
Like a whiny little bitch, actually. But
that doesn't really characterise me very well. Many things.
Precisely.
Not that.
There you go. You can use it about men.
But the more important issue is what you do with a form that is in some ways a cross between a sermon, a diagnosis, and a product endorsement. It's a very tricky mix. And again, when I think of the reviewers that I've tracked through most of their careers, an example comes to mind, like Brian Hode, for example, who wrote for the Bulletin. The first 3 years are great. The next few years, kind of okay. The last 10 years, you wish you'd been hit by a bus. So something goes horribly wrong. And what that thing is, I suppose, varies from critic to critic. But the fact that it does go horribly wrong seems to be almost regularly the case within the Australian reviewers that I've had a look at.
Would you make parallels with other international reviewers you admire, Julian? Or would you say that the same thing happens in Britain or America or Europe?
I thought it was very telling when Michael Billington went back on his review of Sarah Kane.
Yes, I thought that was a very...
And I thought he gave himself another lease of life as a reviewer. I went, wow, if you can change your mind...
He's always been that kind of critic.
Yeah, I think that... Yeah. I do agree that is a very important point, and I think... I think great theatre doesn't just reflect our lives. It changes them, and one of the challenges... Despite seeing in excess of 100 shows a year after year, and I'm my own worst boss because I haven't taken a substantial holiday in quite a while, is to remain open to the possibility of being changed.
I think that is a challenge. I mean, I don't, as I said, seriously, particularly when there's so much pressure on you to kind of, as it were, work with the star system, 3 stars, 4 stars. To me, that is a bright line. I kind of go, I don't mind what you say in words, but once you start putting stars against shows, then the whole thing has collapsed into cartoon land.
Well, I mean, where you're kind of sort of comparing apples and oranges from the sort of, smallest show at La Mama to the biggest sort of musical, it can be unfair, and you have to judge them on the basis of the history of the art, the genre that they're working in, and so on. But I don't philosophically disagree with the star system, and I think time-poor kind of readers of newspapers, sort of any more than I would disagree with teachers being able to grade their students' papers from A to E. I mean,
so maybe we'll move into theatre reviewing where we get 7 out of 10 or 6.5 out of 10. We can have the, so you think you can dance style of theatre reviewing. I'm not sure that this is going to enhance the critical debate, really, Cameron.
Well, I don't think so, but
I think it's the worst thing about film reviews is the star system.
I think so.
I object to the star thing personally. I sort of despair of it. I treat it as though there are sort of certain thresholds that I think, kind of the audience will respond to. If they're really interested in something, then they're going to go and see it, whether it's sort of 2 stars or above and so on. But, I mean, that's, again, judgments, making value judgments. That's an essential part of what criticism is. If you can't say that something is, no stars, then you have no right to say something is 5.
You've got to be able to say what's good and what's bad.
Oh, yeah.